I recently completed this commission to make some curved skirting boards for a fantastic project house. Curved walls are a great way to add character to a property, but also provide a challenge when it comes to the finished woodwork. So in this video, I'll show you the method I used to make these curved skirting boards and why I think it's the best and most economical way in which to do this job. The method I'm going to use here is called laminating, which involves gluing lots of thin pieces of timber together around a template, which is known as a former, in order to produce a single curved piece of wood to the correct shape. Now in some instances this method can be done in situ using the curved wall as the former, but I much prefer making a template of the wall and working on the bench. With that in mind, I use a piece of hardboard to make a template of the wall. Now please note that I've elevated the template so it's positioned at the height of the finished skirting board. And this is the point at which the gap between my skirting board and the wall will be seen, and I've not made the template at floor level. Once I have that template fitting nicely, it's back to the workshop and onto the bench. I used offcuts of boarding that I cut at 90 degrees to give a nice square face, and pocket screwed these down to the bench around the perimeter of the template. So in effect I ended up with a former for my laminations that matched the walls in which they were going to be fitted against. It's also worth mentioning now that I'm making 3 different pieces of skirting here. One of them is an internal curve, and the other 2 are external profiled skirting. So like you saw at the start of the video, the profile runs around the outside of the skirting and the other one is on the inside of the curve. Now we have the former set up, it's time to make the laminations. I'm lucky to have the machinery to do this, but constructional veneer is available to buy if you don't have access to the machinery yourself. I'm using wide tulip wood boards, or maybe known as poplar wood if you're American, and ripping them down to roughly 10mm wider than the finish height of my skirtings. Then it's just a repetitive process of planing one face flat on the bench planer and using that flat surface to rip a thin veneer off the board. I'm repeating this process until I run out of wood and have enough laminations to make up the thickness of my pieces of skirting. I'm using a special rip fence that I built myself. It just sits on the bandsaw and clamps down to the bench, and it enables me to cut tall veneers very accurately against the full height of the blade, which the standard fence doesn't allow me to do. Once I've got all these thin strips of timber, I use a coarse belt on the wide belt sander to sand them down to an even thickness. It's really important when you're laminating that the layers of timber are even throughout the entire piece, which the belt sander is exceptional at doing, especially when used with a backing board for the thinner thickness pieces. I then have a bunch of wood that is thin enough to bend around my former, so I added some supports around the outside which allows me to press the bent pieces of wood against the former nice and tight and accurately, and I started the glue up. Now this is all day one of this project, and I wanted to get the 3 laminations all glued up so that they could be setting overnight and ready to work on again in the morning. Applying the glue is a dream using this glue roller. While it was stupidly expensive to buy, I wouldn't be without it now. It really is superb. So the laminations fit in the gap in the jig, and then I used chunky folding wedges to press the timber tightly around the former. The chunky wedges are best as the face that presses against the lamination doesn't deform, so you get a nice straight face to the skirting board. The most difficult one to do was this one because it had a short straight section before starting the curve, so I used backing boards in order to press the laminations together. As you can see, it worked out pretty well. I'm just doing a final check here by eye, making sure there's a nice straight line into a really smooth curve around that former. The last piece I glued up on a board on the floor, which actually wasn't ideal, and it deflected when I wedged the laminations around the curve, so I had to use some sash clamps to pull it all back together nice and parallel, but I managed to get them all glued up before heading home, which means I'll have all night to dry, and with the heating on in the workshop turned right up, I shouldn't have a problem in the morning. So day 2, and it's time to remove from the former. I'm just checking to see that the laminations don't spring as I release the pressure. Then it's onto the planer for a quick square up of the top edge, and I cut them down nice and safely on the table saw. I now have a parallel piece of wood which is ready for moulding. So curve moulding on the spindle moulder can be done in a few ways. I prefer to use a ring fence, and this is my homemade ring fence that I'm using here. The safest way to do this is lots of small cuts and slowly working your way up to the desired depth of cut. The smaller pieces were easy for me to hold, but that big section was a real handful to work with. So I added blocks to the back face in order to help me keep it square and flat on the surface of the machine. Pretty pleased with that one. Got a little bit of a wobble somewhere here. There's a point at which it was, every time it struggled a little bit with the square board to go over the spindle, so somewhere there, just there, look, there's a bit of a wobble, but that should sand out dead easy. I'm pretty pleased with that. That'll look gorgeous when it's in place. So I went over all the pieces carefully with the sander and sanded all the moulding profiles by hand nicely, so it removed any evidence of machining marks or moulding ripples from that profiled section, and then transferred them to the spray booth where they had 3 coats of paint. This is an incredibly satisfying moment, seeing that perfect coating of paint. It almost made me forget about the fact that I never make any money because I spend way longer than I should on these projects. Anyway, here they all are ready to be fitted, and I just did a final check using the top edge of the skirting board against the original templates that I made of the walls to check everything looks as it should. Back on site, and it's a nice moment pushing them into place for the first time. Because the architrave blocks are already fitted here, it made my life a little more tricky to mark the cuts, but it's a case of accurate measuring and then creeping up to the mark with progressive cuts until it fits correctly. It wasn't one of the easiest cuts to make, especially the one at an angle, but the track saw definitely came in clutch here. I had a bit of an issue with the plaster being thicker below the top line of the skirting, so I sealed the area off that I was working in and ground the plaster back below the skirting line. This wasn't ideal, but I had thought about undercutting the skirting back at the workshop before I came to site. But I didn't want to weaken the laminations and have it warp out of shape, so decided that this was the best route to go down. With the skirting now fitting nicely back to the wall, I drilled the mechanical fixings. Now these drill bits really are a revelation. They drill through timber but also light brick and block without hammer action, so they're really handy for jobs like this where you end up drilling through a piece of wood and out the other side of the wood you hit the wall or mark the wall. Now these drill bits don't lose their edge when you do that, unlike a normal drill bit used to do. I'll add a link to the description down below of my favourite version of these, and I definitely recommend that you get yourself a couple. The skirtings are fitted with an adhesive sealant. This one is called OB1, but any MS polymer adhesive will work here. To screw it back tightly into place and use these little tile wedges, which are superb for cleaning off the sealant squeeze. Again, I'll add the link to the description box down below for these. So the final few jobs here involve filling the fixing holes, and I like to make sure I get a good bond to the timber with the filler by using a dowel or a pencil to work the filler within the hole. Then the last job is caulking the top edge of the skirting. Again, I'm using a MS polymer sealant here instead of just your standard caulk. The reason for that is it adheres incredibly well and it doesn't shrink, so the finish that you leave off the tool when you're finished is the finish you get once it's set, whereas a traditional caulk tends to shrink and needs redoing a couple of times before you get the finish that you want. I think you'll agree that they leave a really nice finish. Here's a clip of me fixing the internal radius skirting in place, the left hand fixings here being hidden by the next piece of skirting board, and as always making sure it's nice and plumb. And there we have it, we're all finished. It will be a while until the decorations are finished, so if you wish to see the finished pictures, I'll put some up on my Instagram, which is at Bradshaw Joinery, and you can go and check them out in a couple of months' time probably when I head back and see the finished result. Hope you've enjoyed this one, and let me know your feedback in the comments. And as always, if you've got any technical questions, I'll do my best to answer them as well in the comments down below. See you next time.